This is the 10th video from It Can Happen Here, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting the personal freedoms guaranteed to Americans by the Bill of Rights. In these videos, we've been exploring the claims that Donald Trump, the Republican presidential candidate in 2024, wants to be a fascist dictator. In our first 9 videos, we tried to define fascism and to infer what a fascist dictatorship would mean for the First Amendment freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly, the Second Amendment right to gun ownership, the Fourth Amendment protections from unreasonable search, seizure of assets and arrest, the Fifth Amendment's protections from self-incrimination, double jeopardy, uncompensated seizure of property, and other unfair treatment by the government. The Sixth Amendment guarantees of a speedy and public trial, an impartial jury, an attorney, and disclosure of charges and witnesses. The Eighth Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, and the Ninth Amendment's preservation of individual rights not specified in the Constitution. Regrettably, we concluded that an American fascist dictator would probably take away most, if not all, of those personal freedoms. In today's video, we are telling you a story of an imaginary American living under a fascist dictator life without the Bill of Rights. The idea is to make sure everyone understands what American fascism would really mean. Harry Johnson was a regular at the Buckshot Tavern in a small Ohio town. Harry had retired after 35 years in a steel mill, but he still manned his usual place at the end of the Buckshot's bar, where he was known to freely share his opinions. He professed to be an expert on sports, culture, and, before President Trump declared martial law last year, politics. Harry's wife Sarah seldom joined him at the bar. She spent most of her time babysitting their 4 grandchildren. The grandkids were Harry's pride and joy, and his cell phone was full of their pre-adolescent pictures. Harry was a very popular guy at the Buckshot. He was always good for a joke or a funny story, and he was a sympathetic listener when one of his fellow patrons suffered a personal setback. This time, however, it was Harry who suffered the setback. One of his grandchildren was seriously ill, but the health insurance company had refused to pay for the expensive treatment the child needed. Harry came into the bar distraught and worried, desperately hoping to find an answer at the bottom of a Canadian whiskey glass. Harry got drunk and started saying in a loud voice, to no one in particular, that the insurance company was a band of thieves who should be arrested. He then started grousing about the government as a bunch of do-nothings who are in the pockets of the insurance companies. Harry's friend Bob asked him which insurance company it was, and Harry bitterly admitted that it was a big company controlled by friends of the Trump family. Bob said nothing. At that moment, Harry lost control and launched into a long rant about President Trump, calling him a crook and a Nazi and a string of obscenities. He eventually broke down crying over the fate of his grandchild. He then murmured, "I'm really glad they took my guns so I can't shoot that SOB." There was a long silence in the bar before the other patrons resumed their own conversations. When Harry left the bar, he was approached by 2 men. They flashed badges and forced him into their car. They immediately took Harry's cell phone and started going through his text messages, emails, and social media postings. Harry was taken to an unmarked building in a nearby town that looked like a warehouse. He was interrogated there for hours by what Harry assumed was the loyalty police. Whenever he fell asleep, he was shaken and sometimes beaten until he awoke. He was eventually locked in a small cell and allowed to sleep. When Harry didn't come home, Sarah was worried to death. She checked everywhere, but he seemed to have just disappeared. When she telephoned or texted friends who had been at the Buckshot that night, they were close-mouthed or unresponsive. Eventually, even her close friends wouldn't return her calls or respond to her texts. Other than her family, she was isolated. It wasn't until the loyalty police knocked down the door and searched their entire house, seizing all the cell phones, tablets, televisions, and computers, that she found out Harry was still alive. After that, however, even her children minimized their contact with her to avoid potential reprisals. Meanwhile, Harry was still waiting for an explanation of the charges against him. Nothing had happened for several months other than daily interrogations. Finally, Harry was taken into a windowless room and seated alone in front of a shadowy panel of 7 men. They said he had been found guilty of sedition and treason. They played the videos of his rant in the Buckhorn. They went through a long list of texts and emails taken from his cell phone in which he was critical of President Trump, the government, or both, going back 10 years. They asked Harry if he had anything to say before sentencing. Harry tried to tell his side of the story, but he could tell that it fell on deaf ears. He started to complain about the unfairness of everything, but bit his tongue, hoping for leniency. They told Harry that his sentence was 5 years and that, if he behaved himself for the first year, he would be transferred to a regular prison where he would be allowed visitors once a month. They also told him that his house and other property would be forfeited to the government immediately. Harry lost it. He started screaming about a kangaroo court and eventually disintegrated into a screed against Trump and his fascist government. They told him that he had just forfeited any chance to have visitors and that they would consider whether to extend his sentence because of his remarks during sentencing. Harry and Sarah live in a world where there is no freedom of speech. There is no right to gun ownership, no right of privacy. There is no requirement for arrest warrants or search warrants, no protection from self-incrimination. There is no right to a speedy or public trial. There is no right to an impartial jury or compensation for seized property. And there is no protection from cruel and unusual punishment. Harry and Sarah live in a fascist America where the Bill of Rights has been revoked or is just ignored. They are living in a nightmare. Join us next time when we will examine the evidence that Donald Trump really wants to be or plans to be a dictator who would impose the nightmare of fascism on America. Remember, fascism can happen here only if we fail to stop it.